I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Alex Galindo. I work in the Office of Student Affairs at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Today, we welcome you to watch Unapologetic and stay for a Q&A with director Ashley O'Shea. The film is part of our fall film series on anti-racism and new Black cinema, a collaborative platform built in response to Black America experience during the COVID pandemic. On behalf of the Harvard Library, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the Harvard Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, we welcome you and thank you for joining us. The film is about an hour and 25 minutes and will be shown straight through, which will leave us with 25 minutes to ask the director questions. Please type your questions in the chat section. Without further ado, we present to you Unapologetic. Enjoy. Welcome back, everybody. Oh my God, first of all, round of applause for
Thank you.
director.
Thank you.
We're joined here by the film director, Ms. Ashley O'Shea. What a wonderful documentary. Thank you so much for highlighting these Black women warriors. What a tremendous job you did.
Thank you.
Remind everybody if they want to ask questions to Ms. O'Shea to type them in the chat box. And I'll go ahead and ask what perhaps might be the most obvious question, but I'm going to ask it anyways, is why did you decide to make this film and what did you hope to achieve by making it?
Yeah, so I came into making this film in the fall of 2015. I had returned to Chicago, and it was around the time that young Black people were continuing to organize around the killing of Rekia Boyd, as you saw in the film. And in that previous spring, Dante Servant had kind of gotten off of from receiving any sort of judicial accountability, and organizers were asking for him to be fired at that point. And so there's basically these monthly board hearings at the Chicago Police Headquarters. That's like this direct forum between citizens and an appointed police board. And so, I've been hearing a lot of buzz on social media and in my circles. And so I decided to go to one of the meetings and was just so captivated in the space because eventually a lot of the young organizers shut the meeting down. And it was just so electrifying and energizing. And the people that were on the bullhorns and leading in the space were people that I had never seen in my formal education. They were young Black women and femme voices, and I could just identify with them in a lot of ways. And so, I just started to look into whether or not there were any comprehensive media pieces that were told about a movement from this specific perspective. And I just came up short. And so I felt like this could be a great time to just explore this perspective and this point of view. And so that's when I reached out to Janaé first and began to film with her. And then it just snowballed from there. And yeah, what I hope to achieve, a big part of the film is obviously to bring more visibility to feminist voices in the movement for Black lives, because as you can see and feel in the film, they're just so brilliant and have so much to contribute, and it's been like that since the 60s and 70s. And so I really wanted to just give visibility to that energy, and hopefully also just provide an archive for that time in Chicago. We also saw the killing of Laquan McDonald, which was like a hallmark moment in the city, and to be able to tell that from a young perspective and a little bit closer to the age of the organizers, I think was an opportunity I wouldn't get again. So I just hopped on in.
And we're so thankful that you did. because as is evident in the film and the documentary, and as we've seen in the media, Black women don't get as much attention as Black males do when they are murdered by police. Similarly, I think that Black women don't get the recognition that they deserve, perhaps even as they kind of lure to within the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I wanted to ask you about your thoughts, because you have this vantage point that's very unique as a filmmaker. What is how detrimental do you perceive sexism and homophobia to be for the movement, and what do you think could be done to alleviate that?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
And certainly I don't feel like we we didn't get as deep as we could have within the piece, just because of how focused we were on Janaé and Bella. But this is, sexism and homophobia have been a part of the movements as well for a very long time. Rape culture and so many other things. I think from the majority kind of trickled into our community spaces. And so I think because we live in a society, in a world that's kind of run, at least in the US, it's centered on patriarchy, and on kind of pushing men and masculine voices to the forefront, that just kind of repeats itself in a lot of our communities and spaces. And and so like I think for a long time organizers were replicating that in movement spaces, and it wasn't really until three Black queer women founded Black Lives Matter, and then even when I was coming into when I was starting Unapologetic, as you saw in the film, a lot of the organizations are coming from the vantage point of a Black queer feminist lens, which has always been present. Like we've not always, but like for a long time, people have been talking about intersectionality. There's the Combahee River Collective who came up with that whole concept, and just it's been here. But I think that's also a big part of why I wanted to document, was because it was something that these young organizations, 1 or 2 years old, were committed to doing, and they knew that it was going to be messy and difficult, and that they would have challenges up against it. But it's one of those things where it's like we have to address it if we really want to achieve all of these forms of justice, because we can't just keep pushing and vying for men and masculine voices in the movement, because if they get free, like what does that mean for Black women and trans people and people that are the furthest on the margins? And so I think the solution kind of lies in continuing to center those voices, and for men and masculine voices to understand that sometimes they have to take a step back, because sometimes it's just not your time, and there has to be a more equitable distribution of power, if we're looking to achieve freedom for everybody, not just one group within another group.
Absolutely. And for me, at least, as far as documentary goes, I feel like your documentary really checked all the boxes for me, as far as being very factual and documenting the lives of women very involved in the movement and in social justice. Because a lot of times people say like, oh, documentaries, the filmmakers are biased, but I feel like yours was, you were just taking a very factual perspective. Were you very intentional about that? Did you wanted to just make it very sort of, I don't want to necessarily use the word neutral, but not so that it came out as I don't know, too biased?
I think that I wanted to make a film that felt like a Black woman made it. I think it's interesting that you felt like it was kind of middle ground, because that's, that probably bodes well for me. But I certainly wasn't trying to run away from it. Like I know where I stand on the issue, and was an advocate for Black Lives Matter before I started this filming process. Um, and so I really just tried to defer to Janaé and Bella and the organizations and collectives in the film, to represent them just as accurately as I could. And maybe that's why it resulted in how you felt about it. And then also, like, we added moments in that were more about the larger context of Chicago politics and the mayor and the state's attorney and the police superintendent, to kind of give a balance and show how like the powers that they were working against. But I kind of reject the notion of objectivity in general, because I think everybody comes, they come with an experience and with the perspective, regardless of how hard you may try to not lean into it. And so for me, I think I tried as much as possible to lean into it, because I didn't want it to feel like an outsider perspective was making it. I wanted it to feel as exciting and energizing as I felt when I first met these women.
No, absolutely, I agree. I think you did a beautiful job because you really brought us into their lives, into their homes, and I don't know. I felt like I was in it, right? Like participating, being there. So I think it was beautifully done. Um, you mentioned, the Chicago's police system and the politics there. After working in this film for such a long time, 5 years, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do you walk away from it with a sense of hope for maybe not just the city of Chicago, but the country as a whole? And if so, what is that gives you hope?
Mm. I think I walk away with it with a sense of resilience. I think it's probably the better term I would use,
What?
because I think, in Chicago specifically, the three kind of positions I mentioned of the mayor and the police superintendent, the state's attorney, those are all replaced by Black people. And, I don't know how much you've heard about the current mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who is in the film as the head of the police board. But she's had kind of a rocky summer around the uprisings that happened in Chicago, and like specifically around the Columbus statue trying to be taken down, and just a number of situations where she really had to deal with Chicago's policing system. And so a lot of young Black people and organizers are having to deal with the repercussions of that situation, and not really starting off at square one, but I would say that, like, people understand her history and the history of like these positions, like as these institutional systems basically. And so there's still a lot to fight against and that they're up against. Oh, did I lose you?
I'm sorry. The system kind of kicked me out there for a second. I
Oh, no
apologize.
worries. I have no clue where you fell off. I was just going.
No, that's totally fine. No, you were talking about how the president of the
The
police
police board. Yeah.
board is having a rocky summer because of currently with the taking down of the statues of Columbus.
Yeah, and just like in general, with protests and different actions happening throughout the city, she really made some decisions around policing that did not bode well for, like, there's people that have charges because of the protests that they did this summer. And so
Right.
I think that, a lot of people from those spaces feel like they are kind of not back at square one, but it's just like a very frustrating space to be in, because, she's kind of championed as this, like, she's the first openly Black queer mayor of any major city. And so she's kind of championed as this like progressive voice, when really used to be a prosecutor, was head of the Chicago Police Board. And so people are really kind of having to figure out ways to strategize around that amidst the global pandemic and, everything that's happening. But one thing that I hope that the film is able to do for folks is serve as, a very like recent history of how people were able to achieve certain goals around justice for Black people, and that they can make the connections between what was happening in 2015 to what we're seeing now, with this current movement. And Chicago's a resilient place. It has, the people there have been through so much, not just with policing, but with food deserts and losing education, just so many things. So I've never felt like Chicago would not rise to the occasion. I think if anything, it's just going to be it's a continual passing of the baton to younger folks and people that are like still have that energy to go out into the streets.
Yeah.
And we'll see with this D-Day coming up on November 3rd, kind of how things pan out, not just nationally, but also there's a lot of local stuff happening too. But yeah, I still feel like Chicago is one of the most resilient places I've ever been, and I know that they'll continue in that tradition for a long time to come.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, because I'm sure maybe you feel the same way. It irks me when people say things like, in the documentary, somebody said it's easy to yell and protest, and I always think like
that was the mayor.
Oh,
yeah.
Nobody protesting out in the streets is like, oh, this is great. This is
I have so much time on my hands.
Yeah, exactly. This is how I blow up some steam. No, it's very stressful and it's very scary. I actually wanted to ask you, how did you feel in those tense moments during the protest when you were, holding a camera, filming these encounters between protesters and social activists and the police?
Yeah, I think a lot of those moments are disembodied, honestly. When I go out into the field with a camera to document, in a lot of ways, I think of the camera as like a shield against police and different forms of brutality. And I really I try to connect to the camera in a way where it's like I am experiencing this through the lens of how the film will eventually be. So I try to just focus on, getting the angles and the images that I need to get. And, obviously you still have to like kind of produce the moment and make sure you're connecting with the characters and everything like that. But even like the Laquan McDonald protest, for example, like that, I just feel like that night in particular, it was kind of just like, there's really no rules here. Like it was just like everyone was just so fearless in that space because it was just such an egregious act that happened, and then you're gonna release a tape so we can just watch it over and over again and then expect people not to be really pissed off about it. And so I think just the level of like righteous rage kind of created this fearlessness for everybody that was out there that night. At the end of the day, like the powers that you're coming up against these are people too with their own experiences and have baggage they're bringing as well. And so it just kind of like broke. It just was kind of like an equalizer in that sense. Like obviously they had batons and guns and things that we like Bella said, like we can't bring those to protest. But I have my camera and I feel like in a lot of ways that shields me and gives me a courage that I wouldn't have just me by myself. So
brave. Speaking of the characters, Alexis Gable writes.
Oh my God. Hi, Alexis. I went to undergrad with Alexis.
Oh, okay. So I so appreciate the work you put into this. Thank you for sharing it with us. How did you meet and choose to profile Janaé and Bella, and how did your friendship with them and their families inform your work?
Mm. Yeah, so I like I said, I initially connected with Janaé after I went to that first Chicago Police Board hearing. And, when I first spoke with her, she told me that she was in her first year of her PhD program. And she was like 24 years old at the time. And I was like, wow, that's really intense. And so I was just like really interested in her journey, like as an academic that was also in movement space. And also like an academic that she's, she wants to write a paper about how Black women and girls are affected by state violence. So I was like, it's all, interconnected. And honestly, I just felt like we had very similar personalities and energies, and I just kind of like went with that. Um, and then with Bella, I actually I first documented Bella at the celebration after Gary McCarthy, the police superintendent, was fired, which is in the film. And it was like really cold outside, and she just like came out in this hoodie and this thin jacket and just like did her thing. And like as you see in the film, like her lyrics and her energy are just amazing. And so I was just down there kind of just like recording the celebration. But after I filmed her, I was like, I would love to, follow up with you further. And then I found out she's from the west side of Chicago and, has this whole history of her family's just like status in the city, the history with incarceration. And I just felt it would be a really interesting and good compliment to Janaé, who's not from Chicago natively, and just they're similar in a lot of ways, but different in a lot of ways as well. Um, and yeah, I mean, part of the reason why it took so long was because I was really spending time to build up trust with them, and then trying to get access to more of their backstory, which is how I eventually went to South Carolina to document with Janaé's family and her, her grandma, which is great. And then with Bella especially, like we knew that the sort of just like prison storyline was going to be a central point for the film because it's literally all like what her work is. But we knew that we needed to add some nuance to it by like talking to her mother, learning more about her like her brother in prison. And that was literally the last scene that we filmed in like October of last year. So yeah, like that trust building thing was really essential to building my relationships with them and their families. And now I consider them friends. And I'm just really excited that they're out in the world in this way right now, because I think not just them but a lot of women in movement work don't give themselves the credit that they deserve. And I just know they're both amazing, brilliant people. And I want to push them to the forefront as much as possible. So.
I did wanted to ask you about that. In the film, there's towards the end this focus on incarceration, and I read the other day that in this country, Black men make up 40% of the population incarcerated, while they make 13% of the total population of the United States. And that blew my mind. And I was wondering, um, were you trying to sort of highlight a little bit or a lot that piece that Black fathers, Black brothers are in prison, and how this is impacting the life of all these women warriors who have to take care of their children, be the head of the household, and they're out there protesting I think for human rights. Is that something that you were trying to highlight, or was that like the relationship took you there more organically?
I think it was more so that I think it was just something that was so intrinsic to Bella's backstory. I didn't really necessarily see it as a gender thing. It just so happened that it was her brother that was in prison, but like her mom spent 7 years in prison when, you know, she was born. So like it's not just men in her family that have been incarcerated, it's women as well. And I think the part of you saying just like there's an entire kind of population of people that we kind of push to the outskirts of society. You know, it took us 8 hours round trip there and back to go visit him, and people do that within like a day. You know, once a month to go see their loved ones, and you know, that's intentional. They put prisons on the outskirts of society so that we can really label folks as like unworthy of any sort of human interaction or knowing of what's going on in society. And Bella is literally the antithesis of that idea because she refuses to let the system, you know, make her forget about her brother, lose her connection to her brother, regardless of what he did or what the crime was, because like at the end of the day, this is not supposed to be a punitive system. It's supposed to be a rehabilitative system, and that is what's not happening. And so I think what we were really trying to document is like the toll that it takes on women, but just families in general, because that is like a portion of your family, a chunk of your family that's just kind of plucked out, and you're supposed to just like move on without them for the next like 30, 40 years. And that's just not something that Bella would like to believe in. And it's, you know, with Sister Survivor in particular, she's working to like have more visible conversations around this, because you know, the idea of prison abolition isn't just like let's open up the doors to prison and everyone comes out. It's like let's start building systems that can give people jobs and education and mental health services so that they don't feel like they even have to commit a crime as America calls it, at least, to survive, you know. And I think it's to try to think about the system from a more bird's eye view and not so much about what's happening individual, like on an individual basis.
One last question, and then I'll let you go.
Oh,
So, as you mentioned, and it is made obvious in the documentary, the protests in Chicago did bring results. What would you say to people who want to get involved in social justice work, protests, who sometimes think like, oh, these protests don't really achieve anything. You know, politicians are going to do whatever they want. The system's rigged. What would you say to them? What words of encouragement would you give them to get involved?
yeah, I mean, I would say that you know most of the wins that happen in movement space are not happening because of, I mean, excuse me, they are like protests are not the main kind of like chunk of why we're seeing shift. And even protests in themselves, like those are a lot of times strategic actions that people have been planning on for days and weeks at a time. And so much is happening, as you see in the film. Janae's doing it through her PhD, Bella's doing it through her performance. And for me, my kind of interaction and involvement in the movement was to make a film about it. And so what I just tell people is that I think there's room for everybody. There's room for everybody in the movement, and it's really about just taking the time and considering how you can best contribute. You know, it doesn't. Not everybody can be out in the streets. It's a global pandemic. It's very understandable, but you know, there's a lot of artists and writers and lawyers and so many. There's just so many cross sections of society that can contribute in this moment. I think that we just have to really sit and consider, you know, what is my role in this? If I'm not, you know, one of the people most affected by it, how do I continue to allow them to center themselves, but also be a good ally in this moment? And then to really just, this is a great time to just educate and you know, read about past and recent movements, because I think a lot of it too right now is just so much rapid reaction and response that people are missing out on that education piece. And that's when like shit starts to hit the fan. So I'm really, you know, as we kind of enter into this fall season and probably start going outside a lot less and things like that, I think it's a great time to just kind of give yourself the space to learn and grow in terms of movements. Like I spent a lot of unapologetic reading about women like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ida B. Wells that I was not taught about in my formal education. And so, I'm still learning too. So that's something that I'm trying to make space for. And I think, as you make those considerations and you're learning in that way, that you'll figure out like, okay, this is what I can bring to this moment.
Awesome. Well, Ms. O'Shea, thank you again so much for making time to be with us and for making such a wonderful documentary.
Absolutely.
I appreciate
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you everybody for joining, and I wish everybody a happy Native Indigenous Peoples Weekend. Take care. Bye.
Bye.